everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am going to be doing my July reading wrap-up. I read an interesting mix of my thrillers, like always, some interesting nonfiction that really ran the gamut, and one unexpectedly intense adult sci-fi. But as a teaser on the thriller front, I read some of my favorite thriller reads of the year, possibly in this video, so stay tuned. But as always, I'm going to go in order, so I will be starting with Passage by Connie Willis. This is the adult sci-fi, and funny little story here, I actually started this book 2 years ago in 2018. I remember when I bought it. It was before Denver Pop Culture Con, and I just kind of got away from it, and I know what it was. It was edits on my book 2, and it just kind of sat on my Kindle for a while, and I finished my last read, which was a really intense thriller at the end of my last reading wrap-up, and I just decided I needed almost like a palate cleanser. I wanted to read something different. So I was going through my Kindle, and I was like, oh, I never finished that, but I liked it, and I think I got toward the middle. Why didn't I finish that? So I dove in, and the answer is it was very long, and I'm going to talk about some of the caveats of the writing style in a minute. But previously, I loved Connie Willis's duology, Blackout and All Clear. It's World War II with time travel. Really good, which is why I picked up Passage. So it's essentially about doctors who are researching near-death experiences, or NDEs, because they are convinced that there is a scientific explanation for near-death experiences, so they're interviewing people who have had them, and they're trying to figure out how to induce them, explain, and figure out what they are biologically, scientifically, so that perhaps they can use that knowledge to bring people back, to revive people, to save their lives. And I knew when I picked it up, one of the reasons I got it is that I saw nebulously that there was something with Titanic in this book, and I'm a shameless Titanic fan. It's always really fascinated me, and I went through a really funny series of feelings, roller coaster of feelings with the movie, the 1997 movie, which came out on my 14th birthday. It was my birthday party movie. And so, yeah, Titanic has always fascinated me, so that drew me in. And it is indeed a sci-fi novel. The main character, finding that their test subjects are really kind of unreliable, some of them might be lying, decides to go under herself, and it's very mysterious. Why does she end up on the Titanic? And that's kind of where it comes in. And beyond that, I don't want to spoil the book for anyone, but it was unexpected for me reading because I knew it was about death. Like, I'm not dumb. Obviously, it's about near-death experiences, and yet smart me couldn't piece together that this book might make me feel things. I mean, when I started it, my mother was alive, and it's 2 years later, and she's been gone a year. And so it ended up being both a really kind of emotionally uncomfortable read, but also strangely cathartic. It goes really deep into ideas about death and afterlife and what it feels like to die. It's a lot. And actually, I got to a point in it, I was feeling very emotional, and I was like, who did Connie Willis lose because someone very close to her died? This feels too real to me. And it was her mother. She lost her when she was 12. And so in that sense, like, I thought it was a good book. I really enjoyed it. It's an interesting, speculative exploration of death, but it's got a lot of great Titanic nuggets in it. It's really interesting, but it's also potentially really upsetting if you have had death close to you. I still enjoyed it. I got a good cry out of this one, triggered some existential dilemmas. It'll honestly do that. If you are a very religious person, I do not recommend you read this book because it gets very existential about life and death, and there are characters who are very into God and the afterlife. Like, there's literally an evangelist type character, and they're definitely painted as the antagonists. which is, it's not an atheist book, but it's more agnostic or secular than anything, and it asks a lot of questions. But much like Connie Willis's other work, it's got a dynamic cast of characters. I really cared about a lot of those characters, and also because it was written in the late 90s, it was like a nostalgia trip if you, like me, were alive at that time. It's really funny because there's entire plot points that revolve around getting videos from Blockbuster Video and not remembering what happens in the movie Titanic, and it's like we could literally look that up on the internet now. It's not like the internet didn't exist at the time, but the author clearly didn't take that shortcut, and in fairness, we didn't have video sites where you could look up clips at the time. So it's like a slice of the late 90s, and that's like, it's kind of fun, but it also ultimately does date the book. That is going to be a real barrier for some readers because it's like almost uncomfortable, the pop culture references in the 90s references, the technology references. And my main quibble with it, I gave it 4 stars instead of 5, and this is the reason. I had the same problem with Blackout and All Clear, and it's mostly just a reader preference kind of thing. Now, of course, the funny thing about Blackout and All Clear is the lack of the shipping that I wanted from it, from Blackout especially, inspired me to write my first novel. I based the ship in my first unpublished book off of what I wanted to have happen in that Connie Willis book. And the same thing here. It's really lacking on a satisfying romance thread, which would not matter if in the 3rd act the book didn't suddenly go, she loved Richard and Richard loved her. Like, there's references to Joanna, the main female main character, being in love with Richard, and also references to Richard feeling the same way late in the game, and there's very little before that that actually justifies those declarations. And I feel like better romance, like a whole other level of shipping, definitely would have made the book even better, because things get super intense in the 3rd act. Like, the 3rd act is a gut punch in this book. That's when I started to like really go, why did I read this? It's like everything that is upsetting to me in life right now, but it was really good. It was ultimately satisfying, but it's a book about death and grief and dying, so yeah, tread carefully. So next I went for true crime non-thriller, because what a great palate cleanser, though really for me, I really do use true crime nonfiction as palate cleansers very often. So I read The Menendez Murders by Robert Rand because of course I watched a Dateline special on the Mendendez Brothers and went, there's gotta be a book on that. And there was. Much like all the other true crime stuff from the late 80s, early 90s, I vaguely remembered it. I remember the top line stuff. I mean, it was on Court TV, but it was really interesting reading about it now as an adult with a lot more context. And ultimately, I found the book mildly dissatisfying. Nothing terrible. I definitely whipped through the whole thing, and the author had unprecedented access to so many people involved in the case, but that's the double-edged sword of the book. So he was a reporter. He reported on it originally when it happened and had unprecedented access to the Menendez family at that time. And those are the contacts he still has. And while he does technically cover both sides, so to speak, he so very clearly is on the side of the Menendez family, particularly Eric and Lyle's aunts, but even Eric and Lyle themselves. He interviews both of them, and he clearly has his own strong hypothesis and feelings of what happened, why, and how he feels about it. And it bleeds through the writing, even when he's trying to be a journalist and cover it without bias. So ultimately what the book is going into is, how bad was the Menendez family? How much child abuse was there really? And how did that trigger this psychotic episode? However, there are those who feel that the evidence strongly supports that regardless of abuse that did happen, that Eric and Lyle are sociopaths who committed a brutal murder, and that it doesn't matter because most abuse survivors do not viciously murder their parents. And I gotta say, the description of the murder, it's quite horrific. And the journalist does present that other side. He covers the prosecutor, which I actually really appreciated. The prosecutor in his closing statement talks about his father who survived childhood abuse and didn't kill anyone. So there are technically both sides, but it's also very clear that the author believes that both brothers were justified in killing their parents and that they shouldn't be in prison anymore, which is kind of interesting. So trigger warning, if you are a childhood sex abuse survivor, do not read this book. If that is a trigger point for you, it is horrifying what is depicted in the book. So ultimately, it is an interesting slice of 80s, 90s true crime fiction, a snapshot of Beverly Hills at the time. But yeah, ultimately a little too editorializing for my taste, but still an interesting read. So I went right into Too Much and Never Enough by Mary L. Trump. Yeah, I bought it. I bought it before it came out because I couldn't resist, and I don't have regrets for buying and reading it, though I feel like, is it a full price buy? I might wait for it to go on sale if you haven't bought it already. But the reason I read it is because Mary L. Trump, in addition to being part of the Trump family, so she had a lot of first-person knowledge of Donald Trump and the family and the dysfunction in it, has a PhD in clinical psychology, so I was looking forward to how she could be very clinical and specific about her family, and the book definitely delivers on that. The book does exactly what it says on the tin. It analyzes the Trump family in particular, going in really deep on Fred Sr., that is Donald Trump's father, and basically goes through how he was a textbook sociopath, antisocial personality disorder, definitely a raging narcissist, and how it impacted the entire family. Now, where it's definitely interesting but might not be to everyone's taste and what they expect, she is the daughter of the Trump's eldest son, so Donald's eldest brother, who died of complications from alcoholism and ill health in his early 40s. So he died when she was about 16, and he was the scapegoat. If you're familiar with narcissistic parents, Donald was the golden child, and she goes into that. And her father was a classic textbook scapegoat, the child who pushed against his father's expectations for him and narcissism, tried to forge his own path, and basically got cut out of the family, fell down a destructive path, and met a horrible end. So there is a large portion of the book that is about Mary's father and his life and his experiences. And so a large part of the book isn't specifically about Donald. He's still there, but just you have to understand the lens of the book. It's almost Mary's own personal memoir of her family, so it focuses on her dad, it focuses on her for large swaths of the book, which makes sense. It's her story, while sprinkling in Donald on the sides. It's still a very apt portrait of that whole family and their dysfunction and who Donald Trump is and how he got there. And I'll say I did enjoy rubbernecking when she finally got into all the financial stuff. It's just mediocre, stupid rich people literally failing up, and she goes over all of the chances and money and loans, and it's just unfair. And you do ultimately come to find she and her brother actually sued their family after their grandfather died, and they settled and or kind of lost that lawsuit, which is interesting because it definitely, I mean, I'd be bitter too. She actually describes a family reunion after that. They fell out from that, and I was like, I don't think you should forgive your family, Mary, but she did. But interestingly, it was actually that lawsuit and all of the discovery and documents for it. She ended up being the source for the New York Times to blow open all of the financial history. Basically, all of the Trump siblings committed rampant tax fraud for a really long time. Oh, we are living in dystopia. But yeah, ultimately, it's a very interesting book, but she only very lightly touches on Donald Trump's actual presidency. There's not a lot of analysis of the bizarro universe we've been living in for almost 4 years, but they did interestingly take care to tack on a chapter to the very end about, it must have been written in June because it mentions not only COVID-19, but also the Black Lives Matter protests. But because of the nature of publishing, they clearly had put the majority of the book to bed long before our recent crisis. So I feel like a lot of us are craving more analysis of the circus of the last year or so, and policy and personality, and so the book's light on that, but that's okay. It did what it said on the tin. I think I gave it 4 stars. If that sounds interesting to you, I don't regret reading it. It was a fast read. It's not a long book, and it was definitely interesting. So next I was like, I need to read some juicy thrillers. I need to read some juicy soapy thrillers about terrible people. So next I read It's Always the Husband by Michelle Campbell. Last month I read The Wife Who Knew Too Much, and I flew through it and loved it, in complete contrast to my experience with Michelle Campbell's The Stranger on the Beach, my first read of hers that I didn't quite like. I am so glad I read The Wife Who Knew Too Much because it made me pick up It's Always the Husband finally, and I loved it. It is definitely my favorite of Michelle Campbell's books. And you know how I've said more than once my kingdom for a boarding school secrets book that holds up? This is that book, but it's college, but I'm okay with it. So half of the book, the first half, is when these 3 girls are freshmen at a fake Ivy League school. Like it's clearly a stand-in for like a Harvard-esque school, but in like a Cornell or Dartmouth setting. Small town, the school basically is the town. The 3 girls are Kate, Jenny, and Aubrey. Kate is the classic rich asshole. We live for it. She's incredibly wealthy. Her father is on the board of directors for the Ivy League school. There's stuff on campus named after her family, the Eastmans. Kate moves into a triple with Jenny, who is our townie character, born and raised in Belle River and at Carlisle, the stand-in Ivy League on a scholarship. She's like the go-getter student council type, the responsible one who takes care of her friends. And our third character, who's actually the one we open on, Aubrey. She is from Las Vegas, like dirt poor. She's got a single mom with mental health and drug problems. And by the skin of her teeth, Aubrey got into Carlisle on a full ride, and her entire future depends on this opportunity. We jump back and forth between their freshman year, which is pretty standard, going to parties. One of them slips academically, boyfriends, some drama, and 20 years in the future when they're 40, all 3 of them are back in Belle River. Well, Jenny and Aubrey have been living in Belle River ever since, but Kate had to leave after something really horrible happened freshman year, and she's moving back for the first time in 20 years. Kate really doesn't want to be there. Her relationship with Jenny and Aubrey is strained, and there's some real adult drama stuff. Husbands, cheating, some shady business dealings. Jenny's now the mayor. Aubrey is a mom with a yoga studio. And Kate, we don't know why she had to move back to Belle River, kind of against her will. And we also know from the very opening chapter of the book, told in third person where you don't know who it is, someone dies. So it's that kind of structure. You know someone's dead because of something that happened freshman year. You're in the freshman year POV working up to the horrible thing. You don't know why Kate had to leave school, but you can kind of make some guesses. And then once we get to that thing, the second half of the book is all in the present when they're 40, and it's who dies and who did it. In short, I freaking loved it. It was exactly my kind of book. Really messy, dynamic characters. They're all kind of horrible, to be honest. Kind of hate to love, love to hate. And there was a lot of kind of messiness. I loved contrasting the girls when they were fresh-faced and 18 and their bitter husks at 40, kind of the choices they'd made and the sacrifices and the people they became. And there was lots of grudges. A ton of people had motives to kill different people, and it just escalates and escalates, and there were lots of really good twists. I was definitely kept on my toes, and it was just a super satisfying read. So if you like those kinds of books, it's the back when we were in school version of Small Town Secrets with consequences later, layered with the domestic suspense element of unhappy 40-year-old women, then I highly recommend It's Always the Husband by Michelle Campbell. I loved it. Next, I read what is now my favorite Karen McManus book, The Cousins. I got an arc, so exciting, and it mostly delivered on my expectations. So it has a very gothic-y premise. 3 cousins, estranged cousins, who don't really know each other. Their estranged grandmother, who disowned all of their parents 20 years ago, and no one knows why. They get a letter from their grandmother's lawyer that she wants to reconnect with them and invites them to spend the summer on this island off the coast of Massachusetts to work at her fancy resort and get to know her. So we get the POVs of each of the cousins. We get to kind of know who they are and who their parents are. It's them meeting for the first time, going to the island, and of course then there are lots of twists and turns once they arrive on the island. Now the premise itself, the setup, I was thinking it would be more gothic than it is, but it doesn't matter that it wasn't the gothic that I thought it might be, because it's the other tropes I adore. Rich people being ridiculous on a fancy-ass island with some small-town secrets. And like, this is purely subjective, but there's something about these characters. I loved these characters, most of the characters that Karen has done in her different thrillers, especially Aubrey. Yes, another Aubrey. There was something about her character and her arc, her relationship with her dad, the dynamics there. She was, I guess, my favorite in the sense that she, for me, was like the emotional pull of the book, the emotional heart of the book, and I definitely think she gets the best arc. But then I loved kind of Millie's personality and her drive, and it has a really good romance thread in it. And then I can't say anything without spoilers, but I liked the dynamics of Jonah's character a lot, the third cousin, and I like how the 3 of them interacted with each other. I was really on board for the ride of all 3 of these characters and what they would get. And via these 3 characters, I felt like I knew their parents too, and the parents are very interesting. Ultimately, you do kind of get the gothic thread through those 3 characters of the sins of the past and family legacy, and I really, really liked that. I think this one is really going to please Karen McManus fans, but especially if you liked Two Can Keep a Secret. This feels in many ways pretty far away from the One of Us is Lying Bayview universe, so to speak, but feels like a companion cousin to Two Can Keep a Secret in the way that it kind of weaves a whole world in a very specific place and has a standalone cast of characters. So yeah, it's now my personal favorite of the 4 books of hers I've read, just because I vibed super hard on the setting and the characters and the tropes that it employed. Slight bummer is you do have to wait for January for this one to come out, but hey, it'll be kind of cold, and the book actually has full-on summer vibes. It takes place in the summer at a summer resort, so it'll be a perfect book to read when you're stuck inside and it's winter. Next, I read another home run YA thriller. It was like a Dateline episode of my heart and soul, page-turning, messy girls, deeply unlikable characters, a book that had something to say, tons of voice, and that is All Eyes on Her by L.E. Flynn. This one might be out by the time this video goes up. Go get it. Honestly, on top of A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, this is one of the best years for YA thrillers we've had in a really, really long time. This book fired on all cylinders for me. Basically, Dateline episode, a girl and her boyfriend go on a hike in Colorado and he falls to his death. She says it was an accident, he tripped, but people don't believe her because she has a reputation. And you get multi-POV of people who know her, who knew him, and what they think of her, how they see her, their opinion of her, as well as the media, what they think. You get snippets of media coverage, all eyes on her. And it's kind of got Amanda Knox vibes, and in fact mentions the Amanda Knox case, but it's the idea that in especially cases like this, when a girl isn't a perfect girl, in this case, the girl, Tabby, well, she had a lot of boyfriends. She had boyfriends before this boyfriend. And so people say horrible things about her because, you know, how dare a girl have multiple boyfriends before this boyfriend? It's definitely a very feminist book. It has a point to make and it makes it. And what's interesting though is that with the exception of one, maybe two of the POV characters, everyone's kind of messy and unlikable, and it's digging into that hypocrisy. Like, there's a character who really hated Tabby and says horrible things about her and is like, she's definitely a murderer, but that character has a chip on their shoulder and they have an agenda and they have a bias. That particular character, it's girl on girl hate. There's a male character who really has choice things to say about Tabby and girls like her, but as the book progresses and you peel back layers and things barrel forward, I'm trying not to give you spoilers about the specific plot things that happen, you realize that everyone has an agenda, everyone has bias. We make assumptions based on what a girl looks like or how she acts, what her boyfriend, who maybe was an abusive cheater, said about her, or was he? And it plays with all of those angles and aspects of any kind of murder case like this, where someone dies and the only person who knows what happened is the other person who was there. And you just can't know, because how much do we truly ever know a person? So don't worry, I mentioned there were one or two likable characters, and they did get me through the book. I mean, I like a good, messy, unlikable character, but it is hard to read an entire book where everyone's unlikable, so I really appreciated specifically the POV of Tabby's younger sister, Bridget. She's a really nice anchoring character, and I like how it played some of Bridget's chapters against Elle's chapters. That was Tabby's best friend, as well as some of the chapters where the characters more very obviously hate Tabby. So in their POVs, you get all of the bad stuff, but I liked contrasting that with bits from Bridget where she directly contrasts something that someone else said, and it's like, well, whose perspective of that situation is true? I like those kind of books. And it does have an ending that doesn't exactly give you an answer. So if stuff like that frustrates you, this book will frustrate you, but I like open-ended-ish endings. The thing is, I feel I got enough from this book to draw my own conclusion, and it's that kind of thing. It's the Inception principle, where you feel very confident in your own theory of the truth of the story, but like, the author's not going to tell you what the truth of the story is. You just have to be like kind of secure in your own idea. And isn't that how true crime is? This is saying something about how we are spectators to cases like this and how we bring our own ideas to things and draw our own conclusions. And I loved it. I also think it has great crossover potential. So if you usually don't read YA thrillers, I do advise giving this one a chance because it has that Dateline feel to it. I definitely think it has broad appeal. And in fact, the author recently sold an adult thriller that is so my jam. I cannot wait for it. The second I get my hands on an arc, it's gonna go in a wrap-up. She wrote an adult one that takes place at a high school reunion with messy girls and toxic friendships, and you know I'm first in line for that. So I highly recommend, if this sounds up your alley, that you pick up All Eyes on Her by Ellie Flynn. 5-star read. Next, I wanted to go from strength to strength, to be perfectly honest, and so I very purposely finally picked up Allegedly by Tiffany Jackson. This one has been on my TBR for a while. I picked it up for my Kindle on sale a while ago and just hadn't gotten to it yet, and I am kicking myself because this book is so good. In fact, second YA thriller in a row that I really feel is adult crossover-y, meaning very broadly appealing. And I mean, it's dark. This book is dark, and I liked that. I like messy books. I like thrillers and suspense books that don't necessarily give you all the answers. Now, they're not sloppily plotted. It's all there, but they leave you to draw your own conclusion. And this book definitely does that. I mean, it's called Allegedly for a reason. Our main character is Mary, who allegedly killed a baby. She was convicted and sent to prison. She calls it baby jail. They sent her to an adult prison and like stuck her in her own wing. It is horrific, but we're with her when she's 16 years old. She's in a group home, a transitional home, having been released from prison. And I mean, it's harrowing. The group home is terrible. Her mother visits her on Sundays and she is a piece of work. But then Mary gets pregnant and she's desperate to keep her baby, but she knows that they're going to take her baby from her because she was convicted of killing a baby. So she fights to clear her name finally. She finally stands up for herself, because how could she stand up for herself when she was 9 years old? And it's this combination of like, you're getting bits and pieces of the past and the present and what was done to her and who and why. And as a reader, you're enraged on her behalf and it's really upsetting. But there's also so many pockets of doubt where Mary, you don't know if she's a reliable narrator, well, because the prison industrial complex has messed her up. Or was she a troubled child? What is up with her mom? There's so much. It is really, really intense. I was like, I had to know what happened. I read it in 2 readings, which for me is very, very fast. I stayed up way too late to finish it. And the book sat with me for a few days. I went into a mini reading slump after this one because I was just so unsettled, but to me, that's a good reading experience. I mean, it goes without saying. I gave this 5 stars. If you like, again, adult crossover, like I feel that it's very broadly appealing. It also, in its own way, even though it's set now, it had like a timeless feel to it that I appreciated. It's not like overly of the now with pop culture and references. It felt like kind of a timeless, unreliable narrator, slice of life, justice, suspense thriller. I do want to offer a slight trigger warning, as I like to do with books, where if suspense thrillers that really hinge on mental health, if that is not your cup of tea, this one might not necessarily work for you. There's definitely strong implications of multiple characters suffering from mental health issues, but they're not specifically named. And there are definitely aspects of the plot and the unreliable narrator that hinge on mental health. So that might not be for all readers. So yeah, slight book hangover. I spent a few days not sure what I wanted to read next, and I decided not to pick up a thriller because I felt like in comparison, it like I was in like a certain tone vibe and I didn't want to pick a thriller that wouldn't hold up to it essentially. So I read nonfiction. Telling you, my palate cleanser. I read The Unexpected Spy by Tracy Walder and Jessica Anya Blau. I requested this and got this from NetGalley ages ago. It is about a woman who was recruited to the CIA when she was 21 years old. She had been a sorority girl at USC, like a pretty blonde. Like there were people who called her Malibu Barbie as an insult to try to get to her. And she worked in counterterrorism right after September 11 and then transferred to the FBI and did domestic counterterrorism. And it's basically a professional memoir of that period of her life. And it was really interesting getting that slice of life of what is it like to be recruited into the CIA? What was it like being at the CIA the day that September 11 happened? Like she had just graduated college and just started this job when that happened. What was counterterrorism like immediately following that? And she has to obscure details, but like she talks about all of these places. She was assigned to Europe and the Middle East from like 2001 to 2004-ish. And it's really interesting. And then when she decides to try the FBI instead, because she doesn't want to be traveling all the time internationally, her FBI training, that section of the book was wow. The CIA stuff, no problem. She is really emphatic. She never felt like there was sexism in the CIA. Like she experienced it from outside of the CIA, but not from within the CIA. But the FBI is a whole other story. She talks about her experiences in FBI training and how vicious it was, how awful it was. It's interesting, and her time in the FBI as well. And now she is a history teacher and she's married with kids. And so it's definitely an interesting slice of life, but it has a few caveats. I will say I almost DNF'd it at the very beginning, and I think this was an editorial choice, probably pushed from the editor side, and she was working with a professional writer to help her write this book. They really build up in the very beginning. I was a blonde sorority girl, and like she tells this story about getting drunk on her 21st birthday and like crawling into the trunk of her hatchback and drunk dialing her dad. And it's supposed to be this color of contrasting that life to like being in the Middle East and bombs are exploding everywhere. But it made me kind of not like her at first. There's this overemphasis on like, I'm a blonde valley girl, which later she does contrast. Like, it's not necessarily the person that she was. She goes more in depth about kind of her childhood and her background and why she joined a sorority. And she's more of like kind of an introvert than all that. Not that you can't be an introvert and join a sorority and enjoy drinking. But meaning I feel the beginning of the book, it's a little grating, but then the rest of the book is better once you get to know her. Though that said, I do feel at many points she fails to kind of acknowledge that at the end of the day, she was wealthy and pretty. So she had a lot of privilege going into a ton of these situations, even if some people were kind of mean to her because she was blonde and pretty. You know what I mean? Like there's a little bit of blonde, pretty, rich chip on her shoulder just because she wasn't the most popular. It's definitely a mixed bag from kind of that perspective, but it was still interesting. And then the other thing that really annoyed me at first, and I almost DNF'd it, and I just had to suck it up and get used to it, but it is a negative point of this book, and I knocked off a star for both of these reasons. The CIA reviewed the book and allowed her to publish it, but they would only do that if they redacted significant portions of the book. And especially at the beginning, I'm like, another thing about the choice of the opening story, you hit a major redaction on like the 3rd or 4th page. And this continues throughout the CIA portion of the book, where in some cases an entire page will be redacted. It's like the whole thing is like black dotted lines. They've deleted entire paragraphs. And very often those entire paragraphs are the context. And they didn't go back to edit what led into whatever that story was and what came out of that story was. So you get a lead in and you get a conclusion without any of the context because it's been redacted for classified reasons. So it means there are parts of this book that are ultimately completely meaningless because all of the things that would give the stories meaning and context are gone. And that's going to annoy some people more than others. I was edging on too much annoyance, like it was really annoying to me, but regardless, it's a quick, easy read. I liked the stuff about training and procedure. It was interesting. So yeah, all in all, it was a perfectly fine read for a few days of my life, and it kind of transitioned me into my next read, which was Mediocre by Ijeoma Uluo. She also wrote, I believe it's called So You Want to Talk About Race, and I haven't read that book yet, but of course it was popping up a ton on people's feeds in June. This one is super my jam. I got it from NetGalley. It's going to be out, I think, in the fall, and its premise, its central thesis is that white male mediocrity has shaped our history in this country and internationally, but she really focuses here our history, our lives, and it hurts all of us. It hurts particularly people of color and women, but it also hurts white men. And that is kind of the lens through which she examines multiple aspects. She goes into American history, specifically westward expansion. She talks about the suffrage movement, feminism, how white men center themselves in feminist spaces. She talks about higher education. There's even a section on football. And of course she does some politics. She analyzes some political stuff like Bernie Bros. It's really interesting. And the thing is, I enjoyed it. I liked how thought-provoking it was because I'm honestly already on board with the thesis. I'm already like, yes, I see this. And some of the book, it was like, I already knew about that, yes. And other parts of the book, it was like, how did I not know about that? Very eye-opening. But it's going to be a book where if the central thesis is already making you angry, I still think it'd be very interesting if you read the book, but it's going to be a book that is going to be an automatic turnoff for a lot of people, and they're just not going to want to read it. Not just men. It also definitely calls out women, overwhelmingly white women who prop up white male supremacy because it's their only way of achieving power. I mean, it's very interesting. So 5 stars from me because I really liked reading it. I would have read more. Every time she kind of did a case study on a certain subject, and they're subjects I'm already interested in. American history, especially like our expansion history, is really interesting to me. Feminism, of course. Higher education, possibly my favorite section. She talks about like the GI Bill and the founding of historically Black colleges and universities and why they had to be created. So I really like that stuff. But she gets personal in the book in several places. Like her family has been swatted, which is really, really terrifying. She talks about backlash, and she's very open that this book definitely took a toll on her mental health. It was really hard to write. You can tell she finished it during COVID-19 because she brings it up. And so I know that, you know, the book isn't longer because it takes a mental health toll on anyone who has to dive into kind of the darkest parts of our history and culture. So like, I will be satisfied with what I have in the book. It was really good, would have read more, and definitely interested in picking up more work by her. She was already on my radar because Lindy West is her sister-in-law. So like, I kind of like knew her through Twitter in that kind of sense, but I really enjoyed this read. If you like socio-political, analytical nonfiction, I definitely recommend this one. So next, I purposefully sought out something that would be very light, frothy, and easy to read, and I settled on Unfiltered by Lily Collins, which I had added to my TBR because I have Kindle Unlimited and I like celebrity memoirs. And honestly, this book just was not for me. Like literally, I'm not the audience. And that became clear really, really quickly. And I still pushed through to finish it because frankly, it was so light on substance, being frank, that it was easy to read. I think I read it in an hour and a half in 2 different sittings, basically. And like, look, this book is great if you are a teen, especially a teen girl, and that's not meant to be an insult. Like, I can tell that's the target audience, kind of impressionable, young, especially girls who look up to, admire, and are fans of Lily Collins. It is a series of essays. I will say the cover copy says groundbreaking essays, and I'm kind of like, hold on, HarperCollins, don't get ahead of yourself. Where basically there's some confessional elements to it. She's very open, and it's great that she's open about having been in an abusive relationship, other times having partners, boyfriends who struggled with alcohol abuse. She talks about her father's bout with alcoholism as well, and she talks a lot about her struggles with an eating disorder. And it's very lovely and candid, though it's wrapped up in basically motivational speak. Her chapters/essays, they're very short for the most part, and it's mostly kind of very top-line, broad motivational things like your voice matters, you matter, take care of yourself, speak up for yourself. And those are all very important messages, but ultimately the delivery is very frothy, very surface, and I found for me, I just didn't get a lot out of it. I was indeed hoping for a slightly deeper personal exploration, and like, there's this massive kind of elephant in the room as you read the book that Lily purposefully or unknowingly just glosses right over, and I'm like, I can't wait for the day that you get older and you either gain the perspective or you're finally ready to do this, because who am I to demand it of you anyway? But she says, like, when I was 16, I decided I wanted to be a journalist, so I reached out to these major magazines and I got published, and I pitched a talk show and it didn't work out, but I tried, and my acting career and becoming a model. And you're just sitting there going, your dad is Phil Collins and you're a millionaire, and you're gorgeous. She's really pretty. I do like looking at pretty pictures. I liked that part, but it's like ignoring the elephant in the room of that is a huge part of why she got all of her opportunities. Her mom got $17 million in her divorce from Phil Collins, who was one of the most successful musicians of all time, and monetarily, apparently he's the second richest drummer in the world. And like, she went to Harvard Westlake. Like, you can't, like, ignoring those contributions to her success, it just feels a little bit obtuse. And it might not bother her super fans, but for me, I'm like, I've really enjoyed your films, but this just feels a little bit silly to kind of ignore that and not talk about any of it. So ultimately, it's a piece of fluff that wasn't for me. I still gave it a rather generous 3 stars, and I think that young fans of hers are definitely going to find something there to love, and particularly women who have struggled with abusive relationships or an eating disorder are going to find something there that is going to be really motivational for them, really speak to them, maybe be eye-opening for them. So it has its audience, and its audience is not me. So what a way to finish off the month. An interesting mixed bag. Some nonfiction that didn't quite land for me, some fiction that really did. Some of my favorite reads of the year I think are gonna come from this reading wrap up. So I'm going to leave you there. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I mean, I'm going to continue to do my reading wrap-ups either way. And let me know down below in the comments, have you read any of these books? Did you like them? What did you think? And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy reading.